I had to switch cameras at the last minute, so I apologize for the delay. I did want to start this stream out without any errors. However, because I'm new to Twitch, I am still on a learning curve. So it's going to be a progress. It's going to be a journey. I hope anybody watching this in the future bears with me, catches up, and has some fun with the stream. So without any further ado, let me start by just introducing myself. My name is Joe. I am a GM as well as a hobby miniature paint and RPG player. So I deal primarily with tabletop role-playing games as well as miniature painting for hobby. With that being said, let me adjust a little bit of my lighting. I do apologize. The technical challenges we have had in prep have been daunting. Bear with me. I do appreciate if you're taking the time to watch the stream, that it is fun and exciting from here on out. Well, you know what? We're going to go with changing this up a little bit. Bear with me. I am just going to flip this around so that we can continue on with better lighting. So thank you. And I hope that's good. I am trying to keep an eye on it as well. I see we've got a little bit of a lean. Again, my apologies. But we'll get this all figured out. And as I mentioned, going forward, I hope this stream gets better and better. It will. It will get much better. So again, thank you if you are taking the time. For me, I just received 2 weeks ago my excuse me, my Bones 5 Reaper Kickstarter. You can see it back here behind me. You can see Sophie's Revenge. You can see in the box behind Sophie's Revenge that I have got a lot of miniatures almost up to the top. So part of this stream, what we're going to be talking about is going to be the Reaper Bones 5. One of the first pieces I ever painted out of the Bones 5 is this Storm Giant, and a fantastic sculpt. This was an add-on that you could purchase separately. So it was its own single purchase, fantastic price in the Kickstarter. I imagine this will hit retail probably in 2022. But one of the things I wanted to do on this channel was really talk about the Reaper Bones 5 sculpts, the Reaper Bones product, the paintability, and give them a score. Now, because I already painted this one for the RCL Challenge League, I'm going to start with this one, and then we're going to pick something else out to start painting for the Go Forward videos. So this initial video may not last an entire hour, just because going forward I want to have it set up so you can get a view of my painting table and be able to see the progress that I'm making painting. If you're familiar with my YouTube channel, you've seen that view before. The YouTube has a lot of painting videos on it, and I'm hoping these videos will also end up on YouTube. But again, new to Twitch, so still learning. So the Reaper Bones 5 Storm Giant is what we're going to start with. The Storm Giant itself, as I mentioned, was one of the things I really wanted to purchase out of the Kickstarter. And for me, this was really, it was designed for two things. The first one is the sculpt looked very well sculpted, even when they just have the CAD renders, all the CAD renders. But also because I've never painted a miniature, a giant miniature this large. While I've done hill giants and ogres I've never done a giant this large. So the scale was a little challenging, just to know exactly how big it was compared to, say, fire giants and frost giants and the like. Scale-wise, I would say it's very similar to the Reaper frost giants. So size-wise, it wasn't super massive in comparison. The sculpt itself, you can see the amount of detail that are put into the giant are really well done. Really well-defined muscle groupings through the legs, through the back, through the chest and abs, even into the arms. One of the things I always look for is the fingers. How well sculpted are the fingers? Because that's a good indication of the miniature itself. And I have to say, this one here, the fingers were sculpted really well. He's got kind of a dynamic action going on with one hand with a couple of fingers bent in and the other two and his thumb kind of out a little bit. So a little bit of a dynamic pose to his hand, which is interesting to see. The lightning that he is holding, getting ready to throw. Also, I give or take spell effects. Sometimes they can be very hard to manage. I prefer them not to have anything in their hands, just because that allows me to convert and give them weapons, whether it's a weapon that's included or a weapon that you purchase separately or sculpt, whatever the case may be. But again, good details, good sculpting in it. The face on this giant also is sculpted really, really well. He's got kind of bushy eyebrows, a well-defined mustache and mouth, well-defined eyes, so they're easier to find to paint, and the details in the face, the lines in around the kind of crow's feet up by the eyes, as well as in the cheek area, they're really well sculpted. The armor and accompaniments, or bits as I call them, also really well sculpted. They have kind of a Kraken theme on the vambraces, which I thought was interesting for a storm giant, because storm giants generally are known to be in clouds, though they have been known, especially more recently, to be in oceans and seas. It doesn't, it doesn't deter me from it, but it was just a little odd for me to think of a storm giant kind of from the heavens with Kraken countenance on his vambraces. And then almost a satyr shoulder piece, a pauldron that's got kind of the ram horns and a humanoid face with a beard and mustache. So a little bit different, but interesting nonetheless. Lots of bits on the front cloak area. A wood pouch that's also got a lock, so almost like a treasure chest. A large leather pouch, and then a sword that is on a chained hanger there. The sculpt also came with the base, so it's sculpted to have that dynamic pose, stepping on broken and crumbled pillars. So on the sculpt, I would say I would rate this really high. I think the sculpt itself is extremely well done. The attention to details and the way those details were sculpted in, just absolutely fantastic. If you're wondering why I'm wearing the glove, it's because I have not yet sealed this, so I want to, if I'm touching the miniature, I don't want any of the oils from my skin to be on it. But for the sculpture, yeah, I rate this really, really high. I think it's a well sculpted miniature. I think the scale on it, when you compare to a regular miniature, so I don't have my Sur 4 scale with me, but compared to a regular miniature, kind of gives the detail on where they're at. Very interesting kind of composure to the miniature. Let's talk about paintability. The bones material has gone through a few different upgrades and iterations, I would say. I have an example here that is a very early bones that I have already put a primer which is not actually a primer, it's just a single layer of gray paint on. The paint on this one here, I really did this for two reasons. I wanted to see how well did it adhere to the material versus this figure here. And I can tell you with the original bones, the same gray paint I applied on this bones as well as this bones. So this bones here, both of them were washed with soap and water and a toothbrush with warm water, and then air dried, completely dried, before I put any paint on. This one here definitely, even after giving the hot and cold treatment, still has a very pronounced bend in the sword. And the paint itself has a couple of areas where it's pulled away from itself on the figure. I did not have any of that with the Storm Giant. With the feel of the material, you could also feel a difference where this Bones figure was a very light gray, almost white or off-white. This one is a very gray color, a very deep gray color. So you can definitely tell they've had some formula changes from the initial Bones to the Bones 5 that they used in the Kickstarter. And I've also been able to play with some of the Bones USA as well as Bones Black. I would say this new Kickstarter, very close to Bones Black in that it held the detail really well from the sculpt. It took paint very well, and the material itself, the little bit of bend that you can see in the sword as well as the lightning bolt is very minor. So this one I did not do a boil and cold water to straighten the sword or the lightning bolt. This one I just wanted to paint to see how it took the paint, and I have to say it took it really, really well. So big kudos to Reaper on that. With the kind of coolness, again, this is all going to be biased as I'm rating some of these figures, but for me, the Storm Giant I thought was really, really cool. So I could see this being painted as a Zeus character, but for me, I did a lot of blues in the skin tones and then off-whites to white in the hair, just because the Storm Giants in the campaigns that I play for that medieval fantasy are very much kind of blue-skinned, with a darker tone, a stormier tone than what I would use for Frost Giants. So very, in my opinion, cool miniature to paint just because of the amount of detail, how well sculpted it was, and the ability to use this for different things, whether you wanted a Zeus character, whether you wanted a Storm Giant character, whatever the case may be. And bear with me, I'm just checking, make sure I don't get any messages that I ignore. So yeah, the Storm Giant for the Reaper product I thought was fantastic. Again, how it took the paint worked really, really well. The sculpture itself, really, really good. If I had to rate this miniature on a scale from 1 to 10, I would definitely give this one a solid 8. The only reason I would not rate it higher is kind of twofold. One, again, it's a personal piece for me. I would rather have it not holding the lightning. And then two, some of the accessories like the pouch and the sword, while I get he's holding the lightning, so he's not going to hold his sword, I personally would prefer to be able to either include them on the sculpt the way it is, kind of in its scabbard, I guess you would say. I would also like the sword to be separate so that if you wanted to do a conversion and have him holding the sword, you could do it without leaving then the gaps at the back of the miniature. But again, those are just personal preferences. That's nitpicking. Overall, yeah, definitely a solid 8, maybe even an 8.5, just because this figure is so cool. And again, so well defined in the sculpt, in the scale, and in the paintability. Very high. Talking about the bones, so, excuse me, I did say that I do have an older Bones miniature that I painted with an initial base coat just like my other. one of the things I wanted to do on this channel was really talk as we painted. So I wanted to pick out a miniature and then sit down to paint it on this video. Logistically, just because of the equipment I have, I'm not able to do that very well. So instead, what I thought I would do is pick out a miniature, and I am going to focus on painting this, and I will have videos that I will post every Sunday on my YouTube channel. I'm going to try to get them to Twitch. I can't promise it just because, again, I'm a novice and new at it. But what I thought would be really cool and entertaining and interactive is, as we look at the miniatures, I would love to have feedback on your thoughts and opinions on what you would do to paint. So what I've done is I've pulled out the next kind of miniature that I needed for my game. I've already used this in game. This is out of the Bones 5, the Greek expansion. This is a Hydra, so starting with 5 heads. A little bit different in that rather than a dragon-esque or alligator body, it's actually just got a snake body. But again, I needed a 5-headed opponent for one of my games, so I went ahead and pulled this one out. And this is what we're going to start with for this channel, for this video series, for this Twitch stream. I've picked out the Hydra, and generally when I'm picking out a miniature, my process is I'll pick out the miniature and then I'll do different types of studies. How do I want the figure to be represented? What are colors? What are ideas and inspirations? So lots of time spent looking at images and reading about both mythology as well as regular science pieces. So for instance, with a Hydra, I'm going to be planning on doing a lot of research on snakes and snake bodies. I recently did this with a Medusa figure as well as a Yuan-Ti figure that I painted. So both of those, I've already got a good grasp on some of the research that I want to do. But I want to take it in a little bit different step. So with the Medusa, I painted her very much to be a rattlesnake pattern. So even into the skin tones, I carried in some of the same kind of tans and browns and spotting color, but throughout the entire snake portion of her body, very marked, just like a rattlesnake, all the way up to the rattles. And I really put that into the snakes on her head as well, so that it was one collective piece of rattlesnake kind of iteration and colors, rather than doing like asps or anything on her head, which would really clash with the coloration of the body. And then with the Yuan-Ti, I did that more of a corn snake because just the colors and everything were a little bit more exciting and exotic and different. Sometimes I really like to reach out and do things that are different. So for the Hydra, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the sculpt, we're going to talk about the paintability, and then I'm going to leave it open for comments to get some information to help decide how we're going to paint this, and then we're going to paint this up. And then at the end of this video, I'm going to jump back and I'm just going to grab something out of the Reaper 5 box that I have so many miniatures of, and we'll have it to discuss next time. So for the Hydra, I'm going to start talking really quick about the sculpt. Again, I used this already in a game, so I've already pulled it out. I've already painted it gray as well as just painted some of the black pieces that I know are going to be stone versus sand, just to start getting my mind around kind of the figure, how it's sitting on the base, and where all the bits are going. So you can see that already has got some paint on it. For me, again, most of the time with mythology, Hydras have alligator or dragon-esque bodies, and then the 5 heads that sprout out from that body, which of course every time you defeat a head, 2 grow back in its place unless you use fire. So very different for it to be completely a snake. It's something that's a little different and, in my opinion, interesting, because when you spring this on a player, Again, as an RPG, I'm thinking about how am I going to utilize these on my table. As I put this on the player, it allows me to change up the stats a little bit rather than having the players who may know a lot about the stats out of the monster manual what the Hydra is. When you put this bad boy down, it obviously does not match what's in the books, in the rules, in the guidelines. So you can change things up and have any chance of metagaming go right out the window. So again, kind of kudos to Reaper for going a little more traditional Greek with the snake body and being a little bit different. Again, as an RPG player, I really appreciate having some of that so that I can be different at my table. The sculpt itself, this one came in multiple pieces. So it had the base and one of the heads was attached, and then 2 sets of pairs of heads. So these heads and these heads were separate. So I actually had to glue them in. That was another test for me. Just like the Storm Giant that has bits that you have to assemble, is how well does it hold the glue? For that early piece when you're doing cleanup and prep, how hard or manageable is it? This one here, I can tell you I've had very few mold lines. I went after those with an X-Acto blade and no real issue. There were a couple that I didn't get as well as I'd like. But again, I use my miniatures for tabletop role-playing game, so unless I'm doing a competition or a commission piece, I'm okay with some mold lines, I'm okay with some, some sagging, I'm okay with, they don't have to be perfect for my tabletop use. So for me, the Hydra itself, again, the material seemed to be really well. I didn't have anything that I needed to remold. When I set it down on the table, it sits flat. There are no big gaps or waves to the base. The figure, of course, came shipped in a packaging, shoved in with a bunch of others, shipped really well. Didn't seem to affect the material, the bones material whatsoever. There on the underside, you can see the actual gray of the bones. I don't know how well that's going to show up on the camera, so I apologize. As a kind of thought process, if I tend to ramble, I apologize, but I will watch this video to look for improvements going forward, so rest assured. For the sculpt itself, the scales, that's something that in a lot of miniatures you can see the sculptors can get, I don't want to say lazy, maybe overwhelmed, maybe challenging, in that it just becomes a crosshatch pattern and no real defined like scales overlapping. This one here, overall, you don't suffer from that very much at all. The way these scales are sculpted really lay nice for a, that trailing edge to be up from the leading edge of the next. So good sculpting in the scale pattern, especially in, of course, the larger areas, but down into the tail you get a little bit more where it's just more decorative cross hatching, but it's really a very small, tiny amount of area that you're dealing with. Aside from that, there's one little crook here where it's very similar, but from the head all the way back to the tail, the sculpts on the scales as well as the banding across the bellies is really well sculpted. Again, this is a level of detail that normally you don't see in plastic, just because plastic generally doesn't hold the form or collect those details quite as well. Usually, unless you're getting metal, this type of detailing you don't see a whole lot. So I'm super impressed with it. Under the jaws of the snake heads, also really well. As some of the snakes have their mouths, mostly closed to where you can just see little bits of teeth, kind of the fangs just starting to spring out. Some of them have them more open, where you get the side of the mouth, the gummy webbing there with the tongue showing. But overall, yeah, I have to say the sculpting is really well done, and the material holds the sculpts really well. It really transferred the details really well. One thing about Reaper too is, whether it's a Kickstarter or not, if you go through and you're doing your cleanup of your miniatures, if you notice the defects, say you've got just a Bones figure that the sword didn't fully mold, or I actually had one Medusa where the elbow did not fill out, so it was just the forearm and hand holding, or reaching for an arrow, and then the stump of the arm on the body. Fantastic customer service. The best customer service for the gaming community that I've actually found. If you contact help@reapermini.com, they get you squared away, no questions asked. So if you did do a Kickstarter and you're checking out your sculpts, really looking at the details, if you do see errors, don't panic. Reaper's going to take care of you. So there again, that's another assuring thing, or reassuring thing to me. While I haven't gone through the kind of deep dive on each of the minis, this is literally the second one I've really given a real good look to after the Storm Giant. But rest assured, if you are a purchaser of Reaper products, if you notice defects or things that did not sculpt well or mold well in the sculpt, contact Reaper, they'll get you squared away. On to the next part. How well did that Bones material take the paint? So again, this is exactly the same grade that I used for this Old Bones, and this Old Bones miniature is just one that I purchased at a local hobby shop. I try to purchase miniatures regularly from local hobby shops, just so they, one, stay in stock, but also just to give them service, they need it. But again, where this one had some areas of the paint pulling away from itself, again, I don't know if it's going to show it very well or not, but just some areas where you can see that light colored Bones material poking through. And it literally is just where the paint did not adhere to the plastic, and it pulled away from itself and left a gap. So just a small window, which is easy to correct. You can go through and just do an additional coat, you'll be fine. You just don't want to do it too heavy, otherwise you're going to obscure the details. But this one here, I can tell you, I have one small area here on the side where I had a little bit of that paint pull away. Aside from that bit on the base, that was it. I've got nothing in the scales or the faces. I've got nothing else in the body of the Hydra. Everything else seemed to go really, really well, and that paint adhesion, which I am using just a Reaper Bones paint. I suppose possibly if I were using a Master Series paint, it might be a little bit different. I'll try that on the next one, just using a Master Series rather than a Bones paint. But the material, the Bones material, really held the paint well. Like I said, I've got one area there where I can see just a couple of little areas that did not get good adhesion. And it's possible that's an area that I missed with my cleaning process. Because generally what I'll do is use just some warm water with a little bit, just a tiny bit of dish soap and a toothbrush, and I'll just scrub them really well, rinse them really well, and then let them air dry for 24 hours before I even touch them, just to make sure they get nice and dry. But yeah, aside from that little bit there, that's it. And for such a large miniature, then that's just really, really well done on that paint adhesion. So for the Hydra, where would I rate the Hydra? Boy, I'm going to be critical on this one here. I'm going to give this one actually I'm going to give this one a 7.5. A little bit lower than the Storm Giant for just a couple of reasons. One, I think the sculpt is really well done. The differentiation is really cool. My only challenges with this, and again, this is completely objective. This is not to knock or anything at all, but for me, I like to assemble the product before I paint it, before I start to paint it. which can be good and bad. On this one here, there are a couple of areas that are going to be a little more challenging to paint. I think the base, while it does have some interesting bits here, with some broken column bits, because again, this is the Greek theme, there isn't a whole lot of other area for me to decorate. So it's kind of a sandy base area. It's already textured, so there isn't a whole lot of opportunity for me to put more of myself in aside from the paint, which for me as a hobby painter, I really like to decorate and make the bases myself or decorate them myself. So that for me was a little bit of a draw. And then when you put the bits together, when you're gluing the bits together, the small little bits of area where you do have a little bit of gap are kind of hard to get to. So if I left this set of heads off where that section joined, I would be able to get in there with some green stuff and sculpt that gap really well. And then this little gap here is, again, easy to do, easy to fix, easy to correct, but that other one is just a little challenging once it's assembled, especially after you give it a coat of paint and start to look at the details. If you're not really test fitting and checking out the details and looking for those gaps, it's hard to get to. But aside from that, a really good sculpt, very interesting and unique and different, still going with that theme. So now the question becomes, how do I paint it? And, what's my inspiration? Am I going to paint it like a set style of snake? If so, what is that style going to be? Don't hesitate to drop me a comment and let me know. But yeah, Hydra, really interesting. That'll be the one that we paint next. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to jump into the box of bones. And I can see we only have about 20 minutes left. Before we jump into the box of bones, I just want to give a shout out to Reaper Miniatures. So with this Kickstarter here, I've talked a little bit about it on my YouTube channel. They do not sponsor me. I am not sponsored by Reaper whatsoever. I'm just a fan. I've been a customer of Reaper for a number of years, easily 20 years. And I really enjoy their company, their products, their customer service, and their community being the biggest one. If you have not checked out the Reaper Miniatures forums, please do so if you're interested in both RPGs as well as miniature gaming and miniature painting, miniature hobby. Fantastic community. They've got a Reaper Con. Every year they have a convention. It's in Denton, Texas. Goes on in September. If you are looking for information on that, reaperminiatures.com. Got everything you need, or reapercon.com. For the Kickstarter, you can see I ordered a ship. It's a large product. I've also got a box of stuff. So I've already started some of the assembly on the ship. We're not going to work on that on this video. What I thought would be fun is, because I ordered the core set as well as a few different expansions, I'm going to just pick something that we're going to paint extremely well. I'm also going to work on picking some things that I can do speed painting with. So I can do a couple of different techniques, and everything from how I'm going to base it different to how am I going to paint it different will do here on the channel. So right now what I'm going to do is just jump up. I just grabbed a bag. Let's see what we've got. I can tell already by the size it's big. This is Shavienra, the Slayer. This is a dragon, and this is a massive dragon. I can tell by the sculpt, the head, which is separate. It does require some assembly, so you can see. But the head on this one has a very pronounced horn on the nose. That tells me that this one is kind of the equivalent of a blue dragon. So start getting your caps on for blue dragon. Next week, I'm going to we'll work together on assembly on this dragon. We're going to talk about the overall sculpt, and then we're going to give it a rating as well, just like we did with the Storm Giant and the Hydra. And at that point, we're going to start working on painting the Hydra as these bits are drying and setting. You'll see the area is going to be very different here because we're going to set it up a little bit different, a little more friendly for painting. And then the following week, we'll start painting on our large, massive dragon, as at the end of next week, we pick something out of the box. Hopefully something much smaller than a massive dragon, because the dragons alone take a long time to paint, especially if you're not using an airbrush, if you're doing it just by hand, which I prefer. So next week we'll crack that bag open, we'll start assembling the dragon, we'll talk about the sculpt, we'll talk about the material, see how well it holds up both for shipping as well as for assembly, and then we'll start talking about ideas on how we're going to paint that dragon, and then we'll start jumping in and painting live on stream the Hydra. Drop comments, let me know what you think, and we've got a few minutes left. I don't see anybody in here now. That's okay. I hope you watch this in the future. I hope it's enjoyable. I hope to hear comments back from you, whether you like it or not. I'm trying something different from YouTube, so I hope you join me, and I hope it brings you enjoyment. Any questions, comments, concerns, shoot me a message. Make sure that you check out our other pages, both on YouTube as well as Facebook, and give us a thumbs up. Let us know where your adventures will take you. Until next time, enjoy and have fantastic painting experiences and gaming experiences.